This property is not your private kingdom, Mr. Thorne. Your ownership is a privilege granted and governed by the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of this association. We require a complete alphabetized guest list for your graduation party, including full legal names and dates of birth, no later than 14 days prior to the event. Failure to comply will result in a $5,000 event violation fine and the immediate cancellation of your gathering. Karen Miller, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, delivered the verdict from my own front porch, her floral muumuu billowing around her like a toxic cloud. Her clipboard, held tight against her ample bosom, was her scepter, and the three-ring binder tucked under her arm was her book of laws. She had the smug, unassailable look of a petty tyrant who had never once been successfully challenged, a look I'd seen on corrupt supply sergeants and tin-pot warlords in every forgotten corner of the globe. My daughter Lily, who had just finished her valedictorian speech rehearsal in the living room, stood frozen in the doorway behind me, her face pale with shock and humiliation. The party, a simple backyard barbecue to celebrate her graduation, had just been turned into a federal security screening. Karen's eyes flickered past me to my daughter, a cruel little smirk playing on her lips. And that's when the cold, quiet calm that had seen me through 20 years in the Army's Criminal Investigation Division settled over me. She wasn't just attacking me. She was targeting my family, and that was a line that would not be crossed. She had just declared war, and she had no earthly idea who she was fighting. If you're sick and tired of power-tripping HOA tyrants and believe that a person's home is their castle, then hit that subscribe button right now. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've got an HOA nightmare story of your own, I want to hear it. You are not alone. Now let me tell you how I handed Karen Miller the shovel and watched with immense satisfaction as she dug her own grave, one bureaucratic demand at a time. It started, as these things so often do, with something small. A weed, not a field of them, not an overgrown jungle, but a single, defiant dandelion that had dared to sprout near my mailbox. The notice was taped to my front door, a crisp, passive-aggressive rectangle of beige paper, informing me of my violation of Bylaw 7.4c, failure to maintain weed-free frontage. The fine was $25. I was a retired Army CID special agent, a man who had spent 2 decades investigating felony-level crimes, from complex financial fraud rings in Germany to murder on remote bases in Afghanistan. My life had been a masterclass in discerning genuine threats from bureaucratic noise. A single dandelion was noise. I plucked it, paid the fine online without comment, and moved on. I had bigger things to worry about. My wife Sarah had passed away 3 years prior, and my only focus was getting Lily through high school and off to college with as much stability and support as I could muster. We'd moved to Oak Ridge Estates for the highly rated school district and the promise of a quiet, peaceful community where Lily could finish her senior year. The house was modest but had a beautiful, sprawling oak tree in the backyard, a tree Sarah would have loved. It felt like a good place to build a new, quieter chapter of our lives. The second notice came a month later. The basketball hoop in our driveway, the one I'd put up so Lily and her friends could blow off steam after studying for AP exams, was in violation of Article 9, Section 2, Prohibition of Non-Permanent Sporting Structures. This time the fine was $50, and the notice included a grainy, zoomed-in photo of the offending hoop, taken from across the street as if it were evidence in a high-stakes espionage case. I read the C, C, and R's. The rule was technically there, buried on page 87, but a drive around the neighborhood revealed at least a dozen other homes with identical basketball hoops. I took pictures, printed them, and attached them to a polite, formal letter to the HOA board, pointing out the selective enforcement and requesting a waiver or a clarification of the policy. The response was a second notice, with the fine doubled to $100 for failure to comply, and a handwritten note at the bottom from Karen Miller herself. The compliance of other residents is not relevant to your violation, Mr. Thorne. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules. This was about power. Karen, a woman who had likely never held a position of meaningful authority in her life, had found her fiefdom in the three-ring binder of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. She wasn't an administrator, she was a monarch, and I was an unfamiliar new subject who wasn't bowing low enough. I took the hoop down, not because I was afraid of the fines, but because I was choosing my battles. My focus was Lily. Her graduation was on the horizon, her future was bright, and I wasn't going to let a petty neighborhood despot cast a shadow over it. But I started a new file, a simple manila folder labeled HOA. Inside, I placed the dandelion notice, the basketball hoop correspondence, and my photos of the other hoops. In my old job, we called it a predicate file. You never knew when a pattern of small, seemingly insignificant incidents would coalesce into the predicate for a full-blown investigation. I started attending the monthly HOA meetings held in the sterile, fluorescent-lit community clubhouse. I never spoke. I just sat in the back, observed, and took notes. Karen ran the meetings with an iron fist. She cut off residents mid-sentence, dismissed their concerns with a wave of her hand, and wielded the CC and Rs like a bludgeon. Her board, a trio of timid-looking retirees who seemed terrified of her, rubber-stamped her every decision. The budget was the most curious part. The financials were always presented in a vague, top-line summary. When one resident, an accountant named Mr. Henderson, asked for a detailed breakdown of the landscaping contract, which had mysteriously increased by 40% that year, Karen shot him down. The board has approved the expenditure, Mr. Henderson. We are not here to quibble over line items. Next agenda point. I watched Mr. Henderson retreat, his face a mask of frustration. After the meeting, I introduced myself. He was a widower, had lived here for 30 years. She's been a nightmare since she took over 2 years ago, he whispered, glancing around nervously. The fees just go up and up, but the services get worse. The old landscaping company was great. This new one, Evergreen Landscaping, is twice the price and half the quality. But no one wants to fight her. She'll make your life a living hell. I thanked him and went home. In my HOA file, I made a new note. Evergreen Landscaping, 40% cost increase. Investigate. It was just a hunch, a familiar scent of grift I'd smelled 100 times before. Financial crime is rarely clever. It's usually just brazen, hidden in plain sight, protected by apathy and fear. Karen was counting on both. She was about to find out I was fresh out of both. The demand for the guest list was the final, irrevocable escalation. It was a move so audacious, so far beyond the pale of reasonable authority, that it could only be the product of a mind drunk on its own unchecked power. After Karen left my porch, I closed the door and turned to Lily. Her eyes were wide, glistening with unshed tears. Dad, what are we going to do? All my friends are coming. I told everyone. Her voice trembled. This wasn't just a party for her. It was the culmination of 4 years of relentless hard work, a final joyful goodbye to her childhood friends before they all scattered to different colleges. To have it threatened, to be made to feel like a criminal in her own home for wanting to celebrate her success, was a uniquely cruel form of humiliation. I put my hands on her shoulders. Hey, I said, my voice firm but gentle. Look at me. This is not your problem. This is my problem. You are going to have your party. Your friends are going to be here. We are going to grill too many burgers, and you are going to celebrate everything you've accomplished. Do you understand me? She nodded, a little bit of the light returning to her eyes. But what about her? The fine. Do not spend one more second of your energy thinking about that woman, I said. I will handle Karen Miller. That is a promise. I walked her back to the living room, where her speech lay on the coffee table. Now let's hear that speech again. You've got a crowd to inspire. She gave me a watery smile and picked up the pages. As she started to speak, her voice growing stronger and more confident with every word, I went to my office and closed the door. The time for passive observation was over. The HOA file, once a thin manila folder, was about to become the headquarters of a full-scale counterintelligence operation. My first call was to David Chen, my old partner from my last posting in Washington, D.C., and one of the sharpest lawyers I knew. We'd been through hell and back together, dismantling a massive procurement fraud scheme that went all the way up to a 2-star general. Now he was in private practice, specializing in corporate litigation, but he still had that bulldog investigator spirit. Marcus, my friend, he answered, his voice booming over the phone. To what do I owe the pleasure? Don't tell me you've already violated the terms of your retirement. I chuckled. Something like that, Dave. I've run into a local warlord. Goes by the name of Karen. I explained the situation, from the dandelions to the basketball hoop, to the outrageous demand for a guest list and the $5,000 threat. I read him Karen's exact words from her notice. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, then a low whistle. Wow, David said. That's not just an overreach. That's a constitutional challenge waiting to happen. Right to free assembly, right to privacy. She's tap dancing on a minefield. What's in the C&Rs? I'm pulling them up now, I said, clicking through the PDF on my computer. But I'd bet my pension they don't authorize background checks on guests for a private residence barbecue. They never do, David confirmed. This is pure intimidation. She's counting on you folding. She's used to people folding. She's about to be very disappointed, I said, a cold resolve hardening in my chest. Dave, I need you on retainer. Not just for this, but for what I think this is really about. I smell money. Bad money. I told him about Mr. Henderson, the vague financials, and the evergreen landscaping contract. So, you think this isn't just a power trip? It's a cover for embezzlement? He asked, his voice shifting from friendly to professional. The hunt was on. Financial rot has a specific smell, Dave. You know it. Inflated contracts with no-name vendors, refusal to provide detailed financials, aggressive suppression of dissent. It's the classic playbook. The power trip is just the enforcement mechanism to protect the grift. Okay, Marcus, I'm in. First things first. Do not respond to her demand for the list. Not yet. Let the deadline approach. We're going to use her own procedural aggression against her. Second, you need to formally request the detailed financials. Under most state laws as a homeowner, you have the right to inspect the association's books. Put it in writing, certified mail, create a paper trail. Every piece of correspondence from here on out is an exhibit. Already on it, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard, drafting the letter. What's our play with the guest list? We're going to comply, David said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. We are going to comply so hard it's going to make her teeth ache. But we're going to do it on our terms and at the last possible minute. First, we build our case. You need to become the most informed resident in the history of Oak Ridge Estates. I want meeting minutes, budget reports, vendor contracts, articles of incorporation, everything. For the next week, my life became a quiet storm of information gathering. I sent the certified letter requesting full financial disclosure. I spent hours in the county records office, pulling the incorporation documents for the HOA, and more importantly, for Evergreen Landscaping. The landscaping company was an LLC, formed just 2 months before it was awarded the lucrative HOA contract. The registered agent was a man named Frank Miller. A quick, open-source database search confirmed my suspicion. Frank Miller was Karen's brother-in-law. The grift wasn't just brazen, it was lazy. It was a family affair. This was the linchpin. It was no longer a hunch. It was a provable, actionable conflict of interest and likely a conspiracy to defraud the homeowners. The dandelion, the basketball hoop, the aggressive posturing, it was all to create a climate of fear, to ensure no one ever got brave enough to ask the kinds of questions that would lead them to Frank Miller's LLC. The $5,000 fine she had threatened me with was probably destined for the same black hole as the landscaping funds. The pieces were locking into place, and the picture they formed was ugly, corrupt, and, for Karen Miller, deeply incriminating. My request for the detailed financials was met with a wall of bureaucratic defiance. A week after my certified letter was delivered, I received a response not from the board, but from Karen directly. It was a curt, dismissive email stating that the summarized budget reports provided at the monthly meetings are sufficient for member review, and that my request for sensitive vendor contracts and detailed ledgers was denied for security and privacy reasons. She had even bolded the word denied, a petty digital show of force. It was the exact response David had predicted. Perfect, he said when I forwarded him the email. This is Exhibit A in our breach of fiduciary duty case. She has no legal right to withhold those records. We'll file a motion to compel, but not yet. Let her build our case for us. Keep digging. My next step was to talk to my neighbors, but I had to be strategic. A direct, frontal assault would spook them. Karen had cultivated an atmosphere of paranoia, and I couldn't afford to be seen as a rabble-rouser. I needed allies, not just signatories on a petition. I started with Mr. Henderson, the accountant who had dared to question the budget. I found him tending his prize-winning roses on a Saturday morning. I complimented them, a genuine compliment, as they were truly magnificent, and we chatted for a few minutes about gardening. Then I carefully steered the conversation. I was at that HOA meeting a few weeks back, I said casually. I was impressed you asked about the landscaping budget. I had some of the same questions myself. Mr. Henderson's shoulders tensed. He glanced over his shoulder toward Karen's house, 2 streets away but seemingly ever present in his mind. Best to let it lie, son, he said, his voice low. That woman, she holds a grudge. I understand your hesitation, I said, keeping my tone respectful. But I'm not one to let things lie, especially when it feels like we're being taken for a ride. The fees go up, my property taxes go up, and for what? A landscaping company that leaves clippings all over the sidewalk? I saw a flicker of solidarity in his eyes. He was a man of numbers, and the numbers didn't add up for him either. I used to be the treasurer for the board, he confided, lowering his voice even further. Before she was elected president, we had a surplus. Our contracts were fair. We had a 20-year reserve study. When she took over, she dissolved the finance committee, said it was inefficient. Now she and the treasurer, a fellow named Bob who's terrified of his own shadow, are the only ones who see the detailed books. This was gold. He was the institutional memory of the community. Mr. Henderson, I said, I'm a retired investigator. I spent my career looking at financial documents. Something isn't right here. I've already discovered that Evergreen Landscaping is owned by Karen's brother-in-law. His eyes went wide. The color drained from his face. I knew it, he breathed. I knew there was something rotten. I'm building a case, I continued, quietly, methodically. But I need more than just my own story. Her selective enforcement, her intimidation, it creates a pattern. Has she come after you for anything? He let out a bitter laugh. Last year, I got a $75 fine because my garden hose wasn't coiled in a perfectly circular fashion, as stipulated in a new rule she pushed through. I have the notice right here. He marched into his house and came back with a piece of paper, identical in its beige, passive-aggressive format to my own violation notices. We had another exhibit. Over the next few days, I replicated this process with other neighbors. I spoke to a young couple, the Garcias, who had been fined $200 because their toddler's plastic slide was visible from the street for 2 hours after a birthday party. I talked to a single mother who was in a protracted battle with Karen over the color of her front door, a shade of blue that Karen had personally deemed historically inappropriate, despite it being approved by the previous board. Each story was another thread in the tapestry of abuse, another piece of evidence demonstrating a clear pattern of arbitrary and capricious enforcement designed to intimidate and punish. I documented everything: names, dates, fine amounts, and the specific, often ridiculous infractions. I took photos of their violation notices. My HOA file was now a thick binder, meticulously organized with tabs for financial discrepancies, conflicts of interest, and resident harassment. Meanwhile, the deadline for the guest list was ticking closer. Lily was getting anxious. Her friends were asking for final details, and the uncertainty was casting a pall over what should have been a joyful time. Dad, are you sure about this? She asked one evening, her brow furrowed with worry. Maybe we should just give her the list. It's not worth all this trouble. I looked up from the spreadsheets I was analyzing, the numbers swimming before my eyes. Lily, I said, my voice softer than I intended. In my old job, we had a saying, you tolerate the little corruptions, you invite the big ones. This isn't about a list anymore. It's about a woman who is stealing from our neighbors and using fear to get away with it. It's about Mr. Henderson's retirement savings being squandered. It's about the Garcias being afraid to let their child play in their own yard. If I let her bully us into submission, I'm letting all of them down. We don't back down from bullies. Not now. Not ever. I saw a new understanding dawn in her eyes. It wasn't just about our party anymore. It was about justice. Okay, Dad, she said, a small, determined smile on her face. What's the plan? The plan, I said, turning back to my computer, is that I'm about to RSVP to Karen's little request, and she is going to absolutely hate my guest list. The plan David and I had concocted was simple in its execution, but profound in its implications. It was a legal trap, baited with Karen's own bureaucratic hubris. She wanted a guest list. She had demanded it in writing. She had threatened a specific substantial fine for noncompliance. We were going to use that formal demand as the very foundation of our counterattack. The key is to frame our response within the context of her own stated concerns, David had explained over the phone, his voice alight with the thrill of the legal chess match. She's pretending this is about security and adherence to the rules, so we accept that premise. We take her concern for the community's well-being and turn it into a weapon against her. We are not just homeowners having a party. We are concerned citizens addressing a potential threat that she, the president, has so helpfully brought to our attention. 2 days before the 14-day deadline, I sat down to draft the most important document in this entire affair. It was not a list of Lily's high school friends. It was a formal letter addressed to Karen Miller and the entire HOA board of directors. I used the official HOA letterhead, which I had scanned and replicated perfectly. The tone was professional, courteous, and laden with the kind of bureaucratic language Karen herself loved to employ. It began, "Dear Ms. Miller and members of the board, this letter is in formal compliance with your request dated May 15th regarding the submission of a guest list for a private event to be held at my residence. I want to commend you for your proactive stance on community security and regulatory compliance. Your demand has prompted me to consider potential risks to the community that I had previously overlooked. In that spirit and to ensure the utmost safety and legal propriety for all residents of Oak Ridge Estates, I have taken the liberty of curating a guest list specifically tailored to address certain pressing concerns that have recently come to my attention regarding the association's governance and financial administration." I paused, a grim smile on my face. This was the wind-up. The next part was the pitch. "Pursuant to your requirement," the letter continued, "please find below the list of attendees for my event, which will be a preliminary investigative conference. Given the sensitive nature of the topics to be discussed, which include potential mail fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion, I have limited the guest list to professionals with specific jurisdictional authority. Their presence is essential to ensure that any findings are handled by the appropriate authorities, thereby protecting the association and its members from further liability." And then came the list. It was not alphabetized by name, but by title. Each entry was a bombshell. Special Agent, Criminal Investigation Division, Internal Revenue Service, IRSCI. Focus, review of tax-exempt status discrepancies and potential unreported income. Postal Inspector, United States Postal Inspection Service, USPIS. Focus, investigation into potential mail fraud related to the mailing of invoices, violation notices, and financial correspondence. Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, White Collar Crime Division. Focus, forensic accounting analysis of potential embezzlement and wire fraud related to vendor contracts. Investigator, State Attorney General's Office, Consumer Protection Division. Focus, review of potential violations of state nonprofit and homeowner association statutes. Certified Fraud Examiner and Forensic Accountant, Private Consultant. Focus, independent audit of all financial records from the past 3 years. I added a final, devastating paragraph. Please note that these individuals will require a quiet and secure environment to conduct their initial interviews and document review. Your written demand for this gathering serves as the association's formal acknowledgement of this necessary assembly. Any attempt to cancel, obstruct, or penalize this event will be interpreted as an active effort to impede a federal and state investigation, with all the attendant legal consequences. We appreciate your cooperation in maintaining a safe and lawful community. Sincerely, Marcus Thorne. I printed the letter on high-quality bond paper, folded it, and placed it in a crisp envelope, along with a check for $25, a prepayment for the dandelion fine I had already paid. just to add a layer of bewildering, infuriating confusion. The final touch was the delivery. I didn't just mail it, I hand-delivered it. I drove to Karen's house, walked up her perfectly manicured walkway, and slid the envelope through her mail slot. As it dropped inside with a soft thud, I felt a profound sense of calm. The trap was set. The bait was taken. All I had to do now was wait for the inevitable panicked scurrying. I had used her weapon, the formal, written demand, to create an unbreakable legal shield for my own actions. She had demanded I convene a gathering and provide a list. I had complied. But the gathering was an investigation, and the guests were the law. She could not cancel the event without admitting she was obstructing justice. She could not fine me without fining me for cooperating with federal agents. She had pinned herself to the wall with her own clipboard. The ball was now in her court, but the court was on fire, and her shoes were made of gasoline-soaked rags. The silence from Karen's camp was, for 2 full days, absolute and deafening. It was the eerie calm in the eye of a hurricane, a pocket of stillness pregnant with impending chaos. I imagined her reading my letter, her smug confidence curdling into pure, undiluted panic. I pictured her rereading it, the words blurring, the titles of my guests flashing like neon warning signs. IRSFBI, Postal Inspector. These were not the names of high school teenagers she could intimidate. They were the acronyms of her doom. David called me on the second day. "Heard anything from the Queen Bee?" he asked, a note of eager anticipation in his voice. "Not a peep," I replied. "I'm guessing she's currently on the phone with the most terrified and underqualified lawyer in the county." "Let's hope so," David laughed. "A good lawyer would tell her to cooperate fully and beg for mercy. A bad lawyer will tell her to double down. For our sake, I'm hoping for a very, very bad lawyer." His wish was granted on the morning of the third day. An email landed in my inbox. The subject line was aggressive: immediate rescission of event demand and notice. The sender, of course, was Karen Miller. The tone of the email was a frantic pivot from her previous imperious commands. The bureaucratic arrogance was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of legalese that was clearly coached but poorly understood. "Mr. Thorne," it began, "please be advised that upon further review by the board, the initial request for a guest list and the associated potential fine for your planned event on June 5th is hereby formally and immediately rescinded. The board has determined that your planned gathering falls within the acceptable parameters of private residential use and no longer requires pre-clearance or oversight from the association." It was a desperate attempt to stuff the genie back in the bottle. She was trying to unsay what she had said, to unring the bell she had so loudly rung. She was pretending her initial demand had never happened, hoping I would simply accept the reversal and call off my guests. She had fundamentally misunderstood her opponent. She thought I wanted to have a party. She didn't realize that my new party, the one with the federal agents, was the one I was now truly looking forward to. I immediately forwarded the email to David. His reply was instantaneous and consisted of a single word: beautiful. He followed up with a call. "She's taken the bait and is now trying to spit out the hook," he said, practically purring. "She thinks she can just rescind her way out of this. That's not how official correspondence works, especially not when it forms the basis for a subsequent action. You have her written demand and you have your written compliance. That's a contract of a sort. She can't unilaterally dissolve it now that she doesn't like the consequences. It's an admission of guilt." My reply to Karen was drafted with David's guidance. It was even more polite and formal than my first letter. "Dear Ms. Miller, thank you for your email and for the board's reconsideration. I am pleased to hear that you now agree my planned gathering is appropriate. However, your initial formal demand set in motion a series of actions that cannot be so easily rescinded. Acting in good faith upon your stated security concerns, I have already engaged with the aforementioned federal and state professional parties. They have formally opened preliminary case files based on the evidence I provided, evidence which your demand prompted me to compile. Canceling their visit now would be highly irregular and could be misconstrued as an attempt to interfere with their duties. Therefore, the investigative conference will proceed as scheduled. We all share the goal of ensuring Oak Ridge Estates is a community free from any hint of financial impropriety And I am confident this conference is the most efficient way to achieve that end. I look forward to the board's full cooperation. Sincerely, Marcus Thorne. I hit send and felt a jolt of pure, cold satisfaction. I had her. She was trapped in a logical and legal paradox of her own making. Every move she made would now incriminate her further. If she did nothing, the investigation would proceed. If she tried to stop it, she would be committing a felony. Her power, once absolute in her small kingdom, had evaporated. All she had left was fear. That evening, my doorbell rang. It was Bob, the HOA treasurer, the man Mr. Henderson had described as being terrified of his own shadow. He looked even worse in person. He was pale, sweating profusely despite the cool evening air, and he couldn't meet my eye. "Mr. Thorne," he stammered, wringing his hands, I need to talk to you, off the record." I led him inside and offered him a seat. He perched on the edge of the armchair as if it were rigged to explode. "This has gone too far," he whispered, his voice trembling. "FBI, IRS. Karen is losing her mind. She's been calling me all day, screaming. She wants me to shred the financials, to delete the computer files." This was the break I was waiting for, the co-conspirator flip. It always happened eventually. "Bob," I said, my voice low and even, "listen to me very carefully. Do not destroy anything. Do not delete anything. Doing so is a federal crime. It's called obstruction of justice and spoliation of evidence. Right now, you are a witness. If you do what she asks, you become a co-conspirator. The difference between those two things is about 5 to 10 years in a federal prison." His eyes widened in terror. "But she said—" "I don't care what she said," I cut him off. "She is trying to save herself by throwing you in front of the bus. I'm offering you a life raft. You have a choice. You can go down with her ship, or you can help the authorities, and in doing so, help yourself." He stared at the floor, his internal battle playing out across his face. What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I want you to go home," I said, "and I want you to make a full backup of every financial record the HOA has. Every invoice, every check, every bank statement. Put it on a flash drive. Then you're going to give it to me, and you are going to be prepared to tell the truth to some very serious people." He nodded, a man grabbing on to the only piece of driftwood in a raging sea. He left a few minutes later, a ghost slipping back into the night. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Check your mailbox." I went outside. Tucked inside my mailbox was a small, black flash drive. The dam was breaking. The flash drive from Bob was the Rosetta Stone of Karen's corruption. I spent the entire night hunched over my computer, David on a video call from his office, as we sifted through the digital guts of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. What we found was both shockingly brazen and depressingly common. It was a classic embezzlement scheme, simple and effective. The core of the fraud revolved around Evergreen Landscaping and two other phantom vendor companies I hadn't yet uncovered: Patriot Security Solutions and Premier Maintenance Services. Patriot Security was supposedly providing overnight patrols of the neighborhood, patrols no resident had ever seen. Premier Maintenance was billing exorbitant amounts for common area repairs, like fixing a single sprinkler head for $900. Like Evergreen, both companies were recently formed LLCs, and like Evergreen, the registered agent for both was a name I now knew well: Frank Miller, Karen's brother-in-law. The money trail was laughably clear. The HOA, under Karen's direction, and with Bob's trembling signature, would pay grossly inflated invoices to these three companies. The payments were always made via check. We cross-referenced the check numbers and amounts from the HOA's bank statements with the invoices. They matched perfectly. Then came the damning part. Bob, in his panicked state, had not just copied the HOA's accounting files. He had copied the entire contents of his computer's desktop, including a folder he had mistakenly named Personal. Inside Personal was a subfolder labeled K-Transfers, and inside that folder was a series of screenshots from a personal banking app. They showed transfers from Frank Miller's business account into Bob's personal account, and, more importantly, into a joint savings account held by Karen Miller and her husband. The transfers were always for a neat 40% of the invoice amounts. It was a kickback scheme. Plain and simple. Frank would overcharge the HOA by 100% or more, and then kick back 40% of the total payment to Karen and a smaller 5% cut to Bob to keep him quiet and compliant. Over the past 2 years, we calculated that Karen Miller had siphoned just over $350,000 from her neighbors. $350,000 meant to maintain their property values, secure their community, and build their collective reserves. Instead, it was funding her lifestyle, siphoned off through a web of familial deceit. "We've got her," David said, his face grim on my computer screen. "This is wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and, given the amounts, it's likely felony-level theft and tax evasion. She's not looking at fines, Marcus. She's looking at hard time." The pieces were all there. The motive was clear. Greed. The method was established. A kickback scheme with family. The cover-up was her reign of terror. The petty fines and public humiliations designed to scare anyone from looking too closely at the books she was cooking. My own ordeal, the dandelion, the basketball hoop, the party, wasn't personal. I was just a new variable she couldn't control, a loose nail she had tried to hammer down, and in doing so, had cracked the entire rotten foundation. My next step was to consolidate my allies. I called a discreet meeting at my house. Mr. Henderson, the Garcias, and 4 other families who had been systematically harassed and fined by Karen attended. I didn't invite Bob. His role was too sensitive. I laid out the evidence on my dining room table. The corporate filings for the shell companies, the flow charts showing the money transfers, the list of bogus invoices. I didn't show them the bank screenshots from Bob's computer. That was evidence for the authorities. But I explained the kickback mechanism. The room was silent, the air thick with a mixture of shock and dawning rage. These were good people. They paid their dues, followed the rules, and trusted that the system was working. To see that trust so flagrantly betrayed, to see their hard-earned money lining the pockets of the very woman who fined them for the color of their door, was a deep and personal violation. "She fined us $200 for our daughter's slide," Mrs. Garcia said, her voice shaking with anger. "While she was stealing thousands from us every month, we had to dip into our savings to pay that. She put a lien on my neighbor's house last year over a dispute about his fence," another man added. "For $500, the man is on a fixed income. He had to borrow from his kids. It nearly broke him." The stories poured out, each one a testament to Karen's petty cruelty, now cast in the sinister light of her larger crimes. Her tyranny wasn't just for the sake of power. It was a tool to distract and intimidate while she bled the community dry. "So what do we do?" Mr. Henderson asked, his voice firm. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold resolve. He was an accountant, a man of order and integrity, and what he was seeing was the antithesis of everything he stood for. "We have an HOA meeting in 3 days," I said. "It's the annual budget ratification meeting. Karen will present her fraudulent, top-line budget for approval. She will expect it to be rubber-stamped as usual. She'll shut us down if we try to speak," someone pointed out. "She always does." "She'll try," I said, a hard smile on my face. "But this time, we're not just going to ask questions. We are going to make a motion from the floor. We, as a quorum of members, are going to make a motion for an immediate independent forensic audit of all HOA finances for the past 3 years, to be conducted by an outside firm of our choosing." David had coached me on the procedural rules. Under the HOA's own bylaws, such a motion was permissible if supported by a certain percentage of members present. With the 8 of us in the room, we had more than enough. "She'll rule it out of order," Mr. Henderson argued. "She controls the board." "And that," I said, leaning forward, "is when my guests arrive." The plan was set. The community was no longer a collection of frightened individuals. It was an alliance. We were ready for the final confrontation. The stage was the sterile clubhouse meeting room. The audience would be our neighbors. And the star of the show, Karen Miller, had no idea she was about to take her final bow. The night of the annual budget meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Word had spread, not in a flood, but in quiet, urgent whispers between neighbors. The story of the party that became an investigation, the rumors of financial wrongdoing, It was enough to overcome the usual apathy that left these meetings sparsely attended. People were curious. They were angry. They smelled blood in the water. My alliance and I took seats in the front 2 rows. We were a silent, solid block of defiance. Mr. Henderson sat beside me, clutching a copy of the HOA bylaws with key sections highlighted. The Garcias were there, their faces grim and determined. Across the room, I saw Bob, the treasurer, looking like a man on his way to his own execution. He avoided my gaze, staring fixedly at the beige linoleum floor. At precisely 7 p.m., Karen Miller strode to the podium at the front of the room. She was wearing a pantsuit of a particularly aggressive shade of magenta, her face plastered with a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. She surveyed the unusually large crowd, a flicker of unease crossing her features before being replaced by her usual mask of imperious confidence. "Welcome, members, to the annual budget meeting," she began, her voice dripping with false warmth. "It's so wonderful to see so many of you taking an active interest in our beautiful community." She launched into her presentation, a slideshow of stock photos of smiling families and perfectly manicured lawns, overlaid with vague charts showing community investments. She spoke of fiscal responsibility and enhancing property values. She praised the excellent, cost-effective services of their vendors, lingering for a moment on a slide featuring the Evergreen Landscaping logo. From my seat, I could practically hear the gears of her kickback scheme grinding away. Finally, she arrived at the main event. "And so," she concluded, gesturing to a single slide with 3 numbers on it, "total income, total expenses, and a paltry projected surplus. The board presents the 2024 operating budget for your ratification. All in favor?" She raised her hand, expecting the usual smattering of automatic assents. But this time, a forest of hands did not go up. The silence was thick and heavy. Only her 2 pet board members raised their hands, then slowly lowered them as they realized they were alone. Karen's smile faltered. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice turning sharp. That was my cue. I stood up. "Ms. Miller," I said, my voice calm and carrying easily through the silent room. "My name is Marcus Thorne, 124 Willow Lane. Before we vote on this budget, I believe the members of this association have a right to know what is actually in it." "This is not the time for questions, Mr. Thorne," she snapped, her face flushing. "We are in the middle of a vote. According to Article 4, Section 3 of the bylaws," Mr. Henderson said, standing beside me and holding up his highlighted copy, "any member may raise a point of order or a new motion from the floor prior to the final casting of a ratification vote. I second Mr. Thorne." A murmur went through the crowd. Karen was being challenged on her own turf, with her own rules. Her face darkened with fury. "What is your motion, Mr. Thorne?" she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "I move," I said, projecting my voice to every corner of the room, "for an immediate and mandatory independent forensic audit of the last 3 years of this association's financial records, including all vendor contracts, invoices, and bank statements. The auditing firm will be selected by a committee of non-board members, and the results will be presented at a special meeting open to all homeowners." The room erupted. Shouts of "Yes, an audit, audit," filled the air. The fear that had held this community captive for 2 years was finally explosively breaking apart. Karen banged her gavel on the podium. "Out of order, this is ridiculous. The books are perfectly fine. This motion is out of order." "Why, Karen?" Mrs. Garcia shouted from her seat. "What are you afraid we'll find?" "This meeting is adjourned," Karen shrieked, her composure shattering completely. She was losing control, and she knew it. "I'm afraid you can't do that, Ms. Miller," I said calmly. And right on cue, the double doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open. 2 men and a woman entered. They were dressed in plain, conservative business attire, but they walked with an unmistakable air of authority. They didn't look like residents. They looked like my guests. The lead man, a tall, no-nonsense individual in his late 40s, scanned the room and let his eyes fall on me. I gave a subtle nod. He then turned his attention to the podium, where Karen stood frozen, her face a mask of dawning horror. "Karen Miller?" he asked, his voice quiet but commanding absolute attention. The entire room fell silent. I'm Special Agent Davies with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. This is Special Agent Rodriguez from the FBI and Inspector Chen from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. He held up his badge. The gold shield gleamed under the fluorescent lights. We have a federal warrant to seize all financial records, computers, and related documents of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. We also have a warrant for your arrest. The collective gasp from the crowd was like the sound of the wind being sucked out of the room. Karen swayed on her feet, her magenta pantsuit suddenly looking garish and absurd. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Bob, the treasurer, let out a small sob and slumped in his chair, covering his face with his hands. Agent Rodriguez and another agent who had entered behind them walked calmly down the aisle, their steps echoing in the stunned silence. They flanked Karen at the podium. Karen Miller, Agent Rodriguez said in a formal, dispassionate tone, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and mail fraud. You have the right to remain silent. As they placed her hands behind her back and the metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the clubhouse, Karen finally found her voice. It was not the voice of an imperious tyrant, but the pathetic, bewildered wail of a cornered animal. But I rescinded it, she cried out, looking wildly at me. I rescinded the party. I just looked at her, my face devoid of expression. She still didn't get it. It was never about the party. The party was just the fuse. She was the bomb. As they led her away, past the stunned faces of the neighbors she had bullied and stolen from, a slow, hesitant applause started in the back of the room. It grew, swelling into a wave of cathartic, thunderous applause. It wasn't a cheer for her downfall. Not really. It was a cheer for their own liberation. The aftermath was a blur of controlled professional activity. While Karen was being escorted to a waiting unmarked car, Agent Davies and his team began the methodical process of executing their warrant. They calmly explained to the assembled residents that the clubhouse was now an active federal crime scene and would need to be cleared. There was no panic, only a sense of dazed unreality. As people filed out, many of them stopped to shake my hand, to clap me on the shoulder, or to simply nod with a look of profound gratitude in their eyes. Mr. Henderson gripped my arm, his own eyes shining. You did it, son, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You gave us our community back. Bob, the treasurer, was taken aside by one of the agents for a preliminary interview. I saw him talking, gesturing, the words tumbling out of him in a torrent of confession and relief. He had chosen the life raft. He would face consequences, certainly, but he wouldn't be going down with the ship. I stayed behind, at Agent Davies' request, to provide a formal statement and to officially hand over the flash drive and my binder of evidence. We sat at a table in the now empty clubhouse, the remnants of Karen's fraudulent budget presentation still glowing on the projection screen behind us. Your file was impeccable, Mr. Thorne, Davies said, leafing through my organized tabs. The timeline, the resident statements, the corporate records. You basically handed us the case on a silver platter. Made our job a whole lot easier. Just fell back on my training, I said. You see enough of these. You know what to look for. Your old CO at CID speaks very highly of you, he mentioned offhandedly. Said if you ever got bored of retirement, the IRS could always use another bloodhound. I smiled. I think I'm enjoying retirement just fine. Besides, my neighborhood watch duties seem to be keeping me busy. We talked for an hour, going over the details of the kickback scheme, the roles of Frank Miller and Bob, and the pattern of intimidation Karen had used to maintain control. It was a familiar process, a debriefing, but this time it was different. It wasn't about a case in a foreign country or a crime on a military base. This was about my home. This was about the place where my daughter was supposed to feel safe. When I finally left the clubhouse, the night air was cool and clean. The oppressive weight that had seemed to hang over Oak Ridge Estates for the past 2 years was gone, lifted as suddenly as a morning fog. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal and administrative cleanup. David Chen, acting on behalf of our New Residents Alliance, filed a motion in civil court to have the current HOA board dissolved and a receiver appointed to manage the association's affairs until a new, clean election could be held. With the federal case pending, the judge granted it immediately. The 2 remaining board members resigned in disgrace. Frank Miller was arrested a day after Karen. His phantom companies were dissolved, and his assets were frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. The federal case against them was airtight. Faced with a mountain of evidence and Bob's full cooperation as a witness for the prosecution, both Karen and her brother-in-law took plea deals rather than face a jury of their peers who, in this county, would likely include people they had defrauded. Karen was sentenced to 36 months in a federal women's prison for conspiracy and wire fraud. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for the full amount she had stolen, which meant her house, her car, and any savings she had were liquidated. Frank received a similar sentence. Bob, for his cooperation, received 2 years of probation and a hefty fine. A special election was held for a new HOA board. Mr. Henderson, to no one's surprise, was unanimously elected as the new president. The Garcias joined the board as well, heading up a new community events committee. Their first act was to abolish the litany of absurd, punitive rules Karen had instituted. The rules about hose coiling, door colors, and temporary play structures were struck from the books in a single, cathartic meeting. The new board hired a reputable, independent accounting firm to manage the books, with all records made available online for any resident to review at any time. Transparency became the new watchword. And then, on a warm, sunny Saturday in early June, it was time for the party. Lily's graduation party. The backyard was filled with her friends, their laughter mixing with the sizzle of burgers on the grill. But it wasn't just her friends. Mr. Henderson was there, holding court by the old oak tree, telling stories about the neighborhood's history. The Garcias were there with their kids, who were gleefully running through the sprinkler. Dozens of our neighbors, the ones who had been fined, harassed, and stolen from, were there too. It had become a community celebration, a festival of liberation. Lily, who had graduated with top honors and was heading to her dream university in the fall, came and wrapped me in a huge hug. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she whispered in my ear. "You didn't just fight for us, you fought for everyone." I looked around at the scene, at the smiling faces, the easy camaraderie, the palpable sense of relief and hope. I thought of Karen Miller sitting in a cell, her reign of petty tyranny and grand larceny at an ignominious end. I thought of the single dandelion by my mailbox that had started it all. Justice isn't always a thunderous affair with flashing lights. Sometimes it starts quietly. It starts with one person deciding not to tolerate a small corruption. It builds with meticulous paperwork, with quiet conversations, with the forging of an alliance. And sometimes, if you're patient and strategic, it ends with a barbecue in your backyard, surrounded by a community you helped set free, with the sweet, satisfying knowledge that the bully who tried to ruin everything has finally and irrevocably been brought to account. The war was over. We had won.